Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining today's Senza Fili Sparring Partners webinar on spectrum sharing, beyond licensed and unlicensed. I'm Kendra Chamberlain, and I'll be moderating the webinar. In Sparring Partners webinars, our debaters discuss a topic and answer questions on video without slides. We would like to encourage our audience to participate in the discussion. Please share your comments and questions through the Q&A tab at the bottom of the Zoom window. Please keep the conversation polite and respectful. Our debaters will do their best to address questions as they go along and as they become relevant to the topics being discussed. Please do not hold your questions until the end either, although we may have some time to answer any remaining questions, depending on how the conversation goes. We'll also be live tweeting during the webinar. You can follow along or participate in the discussion using the hashtag Sparring Partners on Twitter. And one final note, due to the influx in remote working right now on the Zoom platform, we have noticed a slight decrease in video quality. So please forgive any stutters or pauses during the webinar. Okay, now I'll introduce our debaters today. We have Martha Suárez, President of Dynamic Spectrum Alliance, Jennifer McCarthy, VP Legal Advocacy at Federated Wireless, and Monica Paolini, Principal at Senza Fili. And with that, I'll hand it over to Monica.
Okay, I am muted myself. Sorry about this, the usual thing. Well, thanks, Kendra, for the introduction, and I would like to thank both Jennifer and Martha. This is a special Sparring Partners. It's the very first one where we have 4 women. And it's great to see. And in fact, I just saw that Martha's just wrote a very good blog on the DSA website on this. It's really great. Not just because it's a show of women doing this, it's because it's good for everybody to have more women involved in telecoms. So let's get to the topic of today's topic. We're going to talk about spectrum sharing. How can you share spectrum among different users to improve connectivity? And this is really important. And I think in light of the recent events, it's becoming even more important how connectivity is important in our lives. So to be able to use spectrum in a more efficient way to reach out, to enable more people to be connected, to be better connected is quite important. So before I start going, I would like to have both Martha and Jennifer introduce themselves and tell us what they do, and then we will start the conversation. As always, please do send in your questions and comments too. And then we will address them as we go along. So Martha, you want to get started? Martha, you're muted.
Yes,
you'll have the same problem.
Thank you, Monica, and thank you to all the participants of this webinar. I'm very glad of this invitation. I'm happy to share this hour with you. So my name is Martha Suárez. I am the DSA president. I'm an engineer, that's my profession. And I've been working on spectrum sharing for a while. So I think this is the right moment to talk about this subject. And this is a huge opportunity to really implement many of the projects and the ideas and the innovation results we are working with.
Jennifer.
Thank you, Monica. Yes, hi, this is Jennifer McCarthy. I head up the regulatory efforts at Federated Wireless. You know us as one of the spectrum access administrators for the CBRS band, which is probably the biggest sharing experiment that's ever been tried, and we're very happy to report that it's going quite successfully. We're also a prospective administrator of automated frequency control system for the 6 gigahertz band, which is under consideration by the FCC and other countries around the world. So we are in the middle of a variety of spectrum sharing opportunities and are looking forward to leverage technology and all of the partnerships that we've developed in the CBRS ecosystem to other frequency bands and other challenges and opportunities.
That's great. So before we get started and we get into the topic, let's talk about what is spectrum sharing. And so the first thing that I want to say is what we are now going to be talking about today, which is DSS, dynamic spectrum sharing, which is a way to basically use one spectrum band for different access technologies. In that case, the spectrum is shared among technologies, access technologies, but it's one user. We're talking about, in a way, something that it's good in terms of increasing the efficiency of spectrum use, but it's used by different users. They can be using the same technology or not, but it's what we're talking about is how different users, different entities can use the same band. Martha, is that correct? And can you say something about some examples of what is spectrum sharing from your end?
Yeah, thank you, Monica. Before entering to the subject itself, I would just like to mention that Dynamic Spectrum Alliance is like a global organization. We are a non-for-profit and we are a cross-industry organization advocating for laws, best practices, and regulations that will enable efficient use of the spectrum. So that's the first question people ask, like, okay, what do you understand by spectrum sharing? And maybe I can start from the history. Traditionally, we only had two approaches for spectrum management. We had the license approach, like every user has a license. And then we had some frequency bands that were exclusively for unlicensed use. Like the best case for everyone to imagine is Wi-Fi. But then we advocate for a different set of options. Like there are so many options in between. There are different colors and flavors. I like to say that all the time. So we are talking about different technologies that can access the spectrum at the same time where you have incumbents there. So it doesn't mean that you need to completely clear a band to have a spectrum sharing. You could just fix the right conditions and the right regulatory framework for all those users to share a particular frequency band. And then you can, it's a win-win because you could also guarantee the good conditions for the incumbents, but just enable a lot of new cases, a lot of new options. And I'm sure we'll talk about that later, but I think it's just about that option. And it's not only close to one holder, because right now sometimes we talk about spectrum sharing, where the same company that owns the license for spectrum in some different frequency bands can use the two of them, and that's great. But we are not talking about that explicitly. We are talking about a larger ecosystem with different providers, different ISPs, different companies, verticals, like a huge ecosystem can be part of it, accessing the spectrum.
Yeah, and I think that this is really important because, you know, even today, even with, you know, Wi-Fi versus cellular, you tend to have, you know, a more homogeneous kind of people that use the technology. So for cellular, it's the mobile operators, and for Wi-Fi, it's, you know, your home user, your enterprise, you know, a venue owner. So it's still, you know, even within Wi-Fi, it's still pretty much homogeneous. And I think that the attempts that we're seeing right now is to really open up. So the ecosystem is becoming much bigger, and we need that because we need the flexibility to connect people and things in different ways in different environments. And I think it's a reflection of the fact that we rely much more on wireless, and so we need wireless to adapt to our lives or our needs and requirements more so. And in fact, maybe Jennifer, you can comment, because there is another, so we have the spectrum sharing, but there is also the dynamic part of it. Why do we care about dynamic?
Well, I think the dynamic part of this is relates to the nature of the incumbent users that you are looking to protect. If you have static users who are fixed in location and are using the frequencies on a regular basis, there is one type of sharing that could be implemented that's relatively simple, a database type of sharing, for example. If you have dynamic users where their location changes or their usage changes, that makes things a little bit trickier to figure out how you're going to share the spectrum. And there may be different types of sharing techniques that are necessary to implement, such as sensing technologies, where you listen for the incumbent's operations, or they might inform you through a portal, for example, of where and when they plan to use the spectrum. And under those circumstances, we would need to relocate new users who are sharing the spectrum frequency band, or ask them to lower their power, or both in some cases, in order to enable that dynamic aspect of sharing to occur.
Yeah, actually, why don't we go with the first poll? And because this is, we just got a question about what works well and what doesn't not work well. And the first one is to talk about the barriers. And this is just to basically get a sense of what the audience thinks about what the barriers are, and then we will talk about them. And but it's good to see, you know, what you think before we go into it. What is your what you said you come into this Sparring Partners thinking about? So Kendra, do you want to introduce the first poll? I think Kendra, you might be on mute. Nope.
We might have lost Kendra altogether.
But yeah, actually we do. Oh, okay. Okay, well, I'm gonna do that then. Okay, so the first one is the barriers. What is the main barrier to spectrum sharing? Pick one. It's just, we're trying to see what's the most important one. Is it that we need to have a better regulatory frameworks? Is it lack of harmonization? There are not enough use cases, a weak business model, or resistance or opposition by incumbent users? Oh, sorry. See, Kendra usually does it. So you should be able to see it now and you should be able to vote. Sorry for that. Okay, and I see that Kendra is going to be joining us soon again. You know, as she was saying, we're having some issues with connectivity these days. So let me see.
Monica, while we're waiting on the poll,
Yeah.
maybe we can talk about a second aspect of the dynamic.
Sure, go ahead. Yeah.
Okay, great. So I was referring to the incumbent uses, which could be dynamic. The new entrants could also have a dynamic use of the spectrum. They may not need the spectrum in their location at all times. So being able to give people access to a particular frequency band for a particular location, such as a stadium or a sporting venue, is another aspect of sharing that we can be quite flexible in terms of offering spectrum access options. So if you don't need to use your spectrum all the time, and you can share with other people on a temporal basis or from a location perspective, that's another aspect of the dynamic part of spectrum sharing that works both for protecting incumbents as well as enabling new entrants to have the spectrum where and when they need it, but not occupy that spectrum all the time and keep it from other people when they could be using it when you're not.
Absolutely. Okay, so I think we have a problem because I see nobody's voting and we have many people online. So, well, I'm gonna try. Okay, so today we're obviously a little bit challenged, but we can keep talking, and if the polls don't work, well, we'll just actually, for those of you in the audience, can you tell me whether you're seeing the poll?
No, someone wrote that they can.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, so let me, okay.
Monica, can I mention something just?
Yeah, sure, go ahead, yes.
It's
gonna, okay, cool, okay. You can answer now, and Martha, why don't you? Okay, Martha, sorry, go ahead.
Oh, okay. It's just I was seeing the poll. Yeah, I see one of the questions from the audience, and it's asking like, in which cases it is not suited. So I think that that's a question we get all the time, and it's very important to talk about the context and the frequency band. So when we are talking about spectrum sharing, and I think at the end of this webinar, I would like everyone to have that concept in mind. We can have different types of spectrum sharing. So we are used to a traditional kind of spectrum sharing that was mainly in unlicensed, bands with an unlicensed exclusive access, like, for example, we were talking about TV white spaces, or we are talking about Wi-Fi systems, like you have unlicensed networks. And in those cases, you could have, it's a very special case because it's massive, it's affordable, and then we have seen how many users are around the world. We're talking about billions of users. But now spectrum sharing is also enabling new possibilities. And I think we'll talk about that also. And the best use case we have right now is the CBRS framework in the US, where thanks to spectrum sharing, we are somehow enabling 5G. And we are not only talking about unlicensed technologies, but we are also considering use cases where you could have LTE networks and some networks that offer very good quality of service, improved security, etc. So I think, and then we can also have a different conversation about millimeter waves. So one of the first ideas that we need to keep in mind is that you don't have only one kind of spectrum sharing. We have different options and we can use it according to the context. And I think we will talk about the local situation too, because we don't have the same competitive market that we have in the US, for example, in countries like in the case of LATAM. So I think all these solutions, the way you implement them, the way that regulators can decide about how to implement them, it's really according to the local context and the local situation they could have.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think we have the results. So I'm going to end the polling and you should be able to see it. So basically the winner is, among the barriers, is the resistance or opposition by incumbent users, which got 37% of the votes, followed by lack of harmonization, inadequate regulatory frameworks, and down limited use cases and weak business models. So I guess that what people are saying, there is a value to it, but the problem is regulation and resistance by incumbents. Which is this what you're seeing as well? Jennifer, do you want to?
Sure, I'm happy to. Well, as Martha said, there are different ways of implementing sharing. One could be to open a band that where the incumbents are not losing anything. For example, in the case of 6 gigahertz, we are talking about allowing unlicensed services to start operating in that band in a way that would completely not affect the incumbent operations. There should be no perception of interference or frankly even competition between the new unlicensed services and the incumbent services. What some people I think are talking about when they're worrying about opposition by incumbent users is whether you're offering competition to the licensee. So for example, if the mobile network operators have a large nationwide license and you start implementing spectrum sharing on top of their existing license, then someone is starting to use spectrum and offering service theoretically in competition with that mobile network operator. And I think that's where you're going to get some resistance and concern that I'm a mobile network operator. I paid a lot of money for this license. How are you, why are you forcing spectrum sharing on me and enabling competition for it? And I think there are different ways of approaching that. You could either use the stick, which is we're going to force this on you, and if you're not using part of the spectrum to offer service to a particular location, for example, rural areas being a good example, then we are going to allow other people to come in and use the spectrum that you're wasting, as an example. Or you could use the carrot, and the carrot approach could be, we're going to either enable you to offer that spectrum on the secondary market and start generating revenue from either the sale or the leasing of that spectrum to another user. And that could be one way of doing it. Another way could be to say that we will offset some of your build out requirements if you allow someone else to come in and share your spectrum in a particular location. Or thirdly, we might reduce your annual licensing fee. That might be another way. So there is the stick approach and there's the carrot approach towards sharing of an existing mobile network operator's spectrum. There are lots of different ways of implementing spectrum sharing, however, in a way that is not necessarily competitive, but could be complementary to what the big mobile network operators are doing. So I think you have to factor that in as you're contemplating the different ways that spectrum sharing technology could be implemented. Not all of them are competitive or controversial from that perspective.
Yeah, and I just did recently an interview with Mansourani from Ofcom, and talking exactly about this approach, the stick and the carrot, and they're trying to actually combine the two, because so you need to have a situation where there is a value, and as you say, you can say, okay, you get coverage, and then so for a mobile operator, if somebody else builds infrastructure in a rural area, then they can roam on that network, so they can get better coverage, so they can, if somebody else is willing to do that. So there's all sorts of ways in which you can encourage that. But they were also thinking of, whenever you do a license, not for, it doesn't work for the past, but for the future, to think about when you get licensed spectrum, you have priority in using it. Doesn't mean that you have the exclusive use, because if you're not using, there is really nothing for you to lose, as long as you can make sure that there is no impact, there is no interference. And I think that this is a very important role that, like white spaces or CBRS are playing today, into making everybody comfortable that it can be done without suffering any interference or any problem. So that's, so Martha, sorry, go ahead.
No, thank you. I think all these questions are great, and this active participation. I just think that regulators, just talking about the lack of harmonizations, I think that also a misunderstanding that we have with spectrum sharing is that this is like taking away bans from those that have it. And I think it's important to insist on that. This is just another tool in the toolkit for the regulators. It's not like we are saying all the frequency bands should be shared, and we understand that there are different use cases and technologies, and there has been a lot of investment from different industries. So that's important to clarify. Here we're talking about the new options that we could have with spectrum sharing, and how these options are even helping all those industries to continue deploying and having more people connected. As you were mentioning, Monica, like it could be a win-win. If there are some spectrum that is not used, but then you can make sure that others are going to deploy those networks, and that at the same time, you are going to increase the coverage. You have a perfect match between the public policy that is trying to provide connectivity, to provide capacity in the networks, and also a good business model from industry, where you have more stakeholders, where you have more ISPs, where you have companies that are taking part of it. So I want to clarify that, because sometimes the feeling I get, and I always get that question too, is like, oh, but you're trying to get away the others. No. I think it's not about a competition. It's not like this technology is better than that one. There are different use cases, but the reality right now is that there are almost half of the population that is not connected. So if we continue thinking with the same mindset, it's not going to change. I mean, we'll increase the digital gap. What we are proposing here are new approaches, new options, new technologies that can benefit people and also business to close that gap.
Yeah, absolutely. I was trying to, I was looking at the questions. So there's a question about Ofcom. The interview with Ofcom is available on SenzaFili's website, and I will post the link to that. But then there was another question, and maybe Jennifer, you can start with that, to talk about the ecosystem for CBRS and white spaces. And since you're working on CBRS, you can tell us about, do we have the, the ecosystem? Obviously, when you start sharing spectrum, the ecosystem gets wider. Do we have everything in place? And maybe you can talk about that, and then maybe Martha, you can talk about the one for white spaces as well.
Sure. So I think what we are seeing within the case of CBRS is one of the largest equipment ecosystems for LTE anywhere in the world. And I believe that there are multiple reasons that this is occurring. One of which is that this is a globally harmonized or identified band for IMT 2000 and the various flavors of 3G, 4G, 5G that are under the umbrella of IMT. But secondly, in the CBRS band, the FCC gave multiple options for users to access the spectrum. The priority access licenses, which will be auctioned off later this summer, and the general authorized access, or GAA tier, where you do not have to acquire a license, an exclusive license. You can take advantage of using the spectrum like you would in an unlicensed band. However, it is a more managed band than a typical Part 15 unlicensed band, such as a Wi-Fi band, for example. But by having both licensed and unlicensed options for the same frequency band, we were able to increase the number of equipment vendors as well as prospective users for this frequency, and thereby create a larger ecosystem of equipment vendors who are supporting this frequency band and the use cases. So I think part of in the toolkit here, leveraging this aspect of spectrum sharing could be very good for other countries as they're looking at allocating new bands for 5G. Rather than auctioning all of it off on an exclusive basis, they might consider offering both exclusive or priority access options for part of the band, and then offering some of that spectrum for a more GAA, general authorized access approach. I think we've seen other countries try to do something similar where they set aside part of the spectrum for certain verticals or certain use cases. I think that might be overly prescriptive if they are narrowing the the types of companies or use cases that can be accessing that unlicensed portion of the band, and instead you might want to be a little bit more flexible. But the concept is similar, where you provide the MNOs with the kind of spectrum that they're looking for to get the return on their investment for nationwide type services, but also enable a variety of new users to access the band for the locations and the times that they need on a more flexible basis. And together, that combination of licensed and unlicensed in the same band with an interoperability requirement, it really drives the development of the ecosystem for equipment. And I think that's the real upside of what we're seeing in the CBRS band.
Yeah, and I think that it's really we're learning a lot as we go along. So we're going to see different approaches, different bands, different countries, and I think that that's really crucial to really learn, because you can try the best you can, but we really need to practice and see. So for instance, if you look at white spaces at the very beginning, the first attempts didn't work out quite well, but that doesn't mean that there is a potential there. Right, Martha? I mean, we're seeing that happening now, but it took some time to get to the point where it's actually working.
I'm sorry, Monica, I just lost you for 1 second, and I think that was the key part.
Yeah, so for white spaces is a case where we have been learning, because we saw at the very beginning it was not really taking off as fast as we thought we could, but now there are new approaches, and that seems to be working much better.
Yes, and I think that is important to keep in mind. So when we first start talking about dynamic spectrum access, and I think in that FCC was really leading the subject, and they still lead that in many ways. That was the first example. And I think that is when Jennifer was talking about the different spectrum sharing cases. In this case, we are talking about broadcasters. We mainly know where they are located. We know that it's not easy to deploy one station from one day to the other. So it's like kind of, we have the information about those power levels. And I think many countries started working on that. And they created a framework that was, I would say, very protective at the beginning, because the first fear was like to avoid any interference to those users. And we also had some different systems operating here and there, like microphones and different other users. So when that started, we found that in the countries that had a very restrictive regulations and overprotective, there was not a lot of deployment. What we have been learning from the years is that databases were implemented. They worked very well. I personally asked Ofcom in the last meeting I had with them, did you get any complaints from the users in those many years? And the answer is 100% no. I mean, no one complained because the rules were set in place and with the right conditions. But also there is a trade-off. Like if we want to have more deployment, we need to at some point learn from the experience and then consider the use cases. And that's what the FCC is doing right now. They're changing the regulation. There's a proposal from the FCC and it's for comments now, where they're increasing the height of the antennas in those places that are less congested areas. They're increasing the power. So in those places, you can just have more coverage. And I think the vision now for TV white spaces is not only about one link between 2 points and that's it. There is a massive view. And I think that's part of the secret, like which is the approach that we are going to take. And there are also more and more countries that are adopting the technology because they had experience from those that adopted first. And that's why now they feel comfortable and it creates a larger ecosystem. But all that with the TV white spaces experience is also a great first step for the new technologies we're having, where the incumbents are much more dynamic and where we have different kind of technologies for spectrum sharing. So here we are, as Jennifer was mentioning with CBRS, we are talking about LTE networks. So we can have, you know, like a lot of new possibilities. We can also have tier share scheme, spectrum schemes, models that can be used in different countries. Because CBRS is very US focused, but also other countries are considering options about how they could have this kind of tier share model. And they are considering many great ideas. I saw some questions about the Ofcom localized license and share access. I think we could talk about that. But that idea could be also expanded to more countries that don't have good coverage and that would like to have more and more stations and coverage everywhere.
No, absolutely, yeah, and I think that we're going to see different approaches and for different type of areas as well, because CBRS, for instance, is you still do the licensing at a wide area, not a tiny area as they're trying to do in the UK, which I think is very interesting because you can have your tiny little license. So it's really much more effective if you want to get the enterprise or a rural or low density service providers, which do not need a county, right? So now one thing that I see in a lot of questions, there seems to be a constant theme. It's like, okay, so when you want to share spectrum, there is the incumbent as priority, clearly. Now, the question is that how can we protect the non-incumbent, the new entrant that wants to use the spectrum, and to use the spectrum, they obviously have to put an investment. So if I'm a wireless ISP and I want to use white spaces, I still need to put the infrastructure in place, but I do not have a guaranteed access to that spectrum. How can we protect the non, or how they are protected? How can we protect it, or do they have enough protection? What do you think?
New entrants.
Yeah,
I think that might be one of the downfalls of how TV white spaces was introduced in the United States anyway, was, when the concept was originally, it started to be implemented, we had a lot more white space. There was a lot more broadcasting spectrum available at the beginning. And then halfway through the implementation of TV white spaces, the FCC sort of took a different direction and decided to repack the broadcasters into less spectrum and auction off the 600 megahertz band on an exclusive basis to the mobile broadband community, thereby reducing the amount of white spaces that was actually available for TV white space users. So I think the lesson from that is to know that you need a sufficient amount of spectrum that you're going to offer new entrants to guarantee them access over the long run. I don't want to cut off incumbents from being able to grow their service and change their operations as needed. That it has to be an important component for the incumbents to be willing to share their frequencies, is knowing that they're going to be able to continue to operate and to make the necessary adjustments to their operations. But I think making sure that you've got a sufficient amount of spectrum that's involved so that the new entrants and the incumbents can both make a good business case out of this shared use is going to be important. That's actually one of the things that we were looking at in the 6 gigahertz band, at the request of the FCC, was to take a close look at some of the most densely used markets in the United States in 6 gigahertz. So we looked at New York City and San Francisco and Dallas that had very different topographies, and took a look to see how much spectrum is actually going to be available for new unlicensed users. Is it worth them building equipment to go into these markets? And what we were able to find is that, yes, there's, on average about 700 available, across a metro area, even in those densely encumbered markets. So, as long as you've got a large enough band and there's sufficient space for both services to operate, I think that you can have enough of a guarantee both to the incumbents that they'll be protected and have flexibility, and to the new entrants that they can get the return on the investment that they need to make this a success.
If I can add something, Monica.
Sure. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think that I come back to my main point before about the context. So while we can see in the US that, as Jennifer was mentioning, that there are more and more increased use of some frequency bands, in other countries it's not the case. So for example, when you go to see in some countries, the number of broadcasters they have in the UHF frequency band, you notice that there are a couple of national channels, and then in the isolated places, almost all of the spectrum is available. I mean, it's empty, no one is using it. So I really think it's important to see this as an option. I insist on that concept. If it fits you, if you have the availability of the spectrum, then go ahead. If your policy goal is to provide more options and you're neutral and you're giving the option to everyone, just implement it. But I also think it's important from the beginning, and that's being a regulator is not easy because you have to manage all those requests. Sometimes people, for example, with the 6 gigahertz discussion, we are advocating for 1200 megahertz of spectrum for unlicensed. And some people say like, oh, but that's a lot. But it doesn't mean that we are going to use the 1200 megahertz at the same time everywhere, because in some places you are just using part of that band for fixed links or for other kind of usage. And it's just to give the opportunity to have a large amount of spectrum, but please keep in mind that it will be shared, and then you have to protect incumbents. So at the end, when you notice the right amount of spectrum that is available for use in a particular place, in a particular moment, that is not that large. So I think it's important to keep in mind the context, and for the regulators to give a flexible framework that it could change, because you never know how it could happen with the time, but regulation is also flexible. That it doesn't mean that the rules we are implementing today are not going to be reviewed into years. So we are really mentioning that to the regulators. Keep that in mind. If you have the certainty that you're going to protect the incumbents and you can make a more efficient use of the spectrum, go ahead. I mean, if you have the right certainty conditions, you could get a lot from spectrum sharing.
Yeah, and I think that going back to the 6 gigahertz, which is a huge opportunity because a lot of spectrum, good spectrum, so on and so forth, you look at it and, the big players, so to say, which would be the incumbents, if that's licensed, they can still use it. So mobile operators can still, nobody is going to be excluded from the band. So, and if you have a lot of spectrum, there is going to be spectrum for everywhere and for everybody, and as Jennifer, you were saying, even, for a lot of spectrum bands, there is still a lot of places where it's not as used as intensively as it could. And if you look at Wi-Fi, which is basically, where to share spectrum, the usage of the spectrum in those bands is incredibly high. Clearly, you cannot have everything unlicensed because then you do not have the wide area coverage that you need. But the combination of the two makes it possible to use spectrum more efficiently. And the reason is not because Wi-Fi is a better technology than, 3GPP technologies, is that it can be reused more efficiently because many people can use it. It's not magic. It's like, very basic. So I think that that's really an important part. Why don't we go with the second poll? And I think Kendra is back. And if Kendra, can you introduce the next poll?
I can, Monica. Can you make me co-host?
Oh, I'm sorry. Okay, let me do this. Sorry about that. Okay. Yes, I think Kendra, you can go now.
Yes. Okay, second poll. If you have to pick one, what is the main benefit of sharing spectrum? A, bridge the digital divide. B, enable the 5G ecosystem with multiple spectrum access approaches. C, accelerate adoption of IoT applications and enterprise private networks. D, make an efficient and innovative use of the spectrum. E, improve indoor connectivity. F, improve outdoor connectivity. And G, no benefit.
Okay, so now we're going to move to the sort of the positives. What is it? So far we were talking about how can you enable it. And so now we can start talking a little bit about what is it good for anyway. And, as Martha was saying, we really need to keep in mind that it's for different, there are different benefits depending on who you are, where you are, what's the regulation. And I think it's, regulators are getting more and more aware of the fact that we need to explore new ways to look at the spectrum. And Martha, do you want to comment on how do you work with regulators? Do you what is your role in dealing with them?
Well, it's important to say that before being the president of DSA, I was the general director of the National Spectrum Agency in Colombia, and I must say that I understand the regulators very well because they're dealing with a lot of important decisions, and sometimes it's like the impact of their decisions is not immediate, especially for spectrum management. It's like when you're working in other areas of telecoms, you just see the impact immediately. But in the case of spectrum management, it can take a while. So what I see is that there are many options, and I used to repeat that we had a mantra, efficient use of the spectrum, and that's something we are always trying to focus on. And I think it's important to understand that there are many options out there. Sometimes you have the fear of how they're going to work, if they're really going to protect the incumbents, if you can really manage the access with those tools. But I like also to say that they are there. I mean, they have been tried. We have great examples, and we are proving that it works. So coming back to the discussion about the 6 gigahertz, I think also it makes a great link with the public policy goals, because in many countries in Latam, in Africa, the first access that people have to internet is through a hotspot. And there are many national plans. If you go and you compare them, many governments have been investing in creating hotspots and opportunities for people to use Wi-Fi at libraries, at schools, at the hospitals. So at some point, if we don't think about it, there will be a shortage of spectrum. There will be a problem, a bottleneck. And I'm imagining a world where we have 5G and great mobile networks, but most of the people use Wi-Fi at home. And in the 5G ecosystem, about 70% of the mobile traffic will be offloaded to Wi-Fi. That's right now it's about 50%. So I think it's an important question first. And then the other part of the application is about the very low power devices. That's extremely important because we are imagining a world, a connected world with glasses, with virtual reality, augmented reality, sensors everywhere. And I think it's important to ask you the question, like, are all those devices going to be using a SIM card or connected to the 5G network? I think it will, I mean, that could happen, but then the cost might change. So it's important to think that many of those devices are going to use unlicensed spectrum. And if we want to have very high throughputs and low latency that will be part of the ecosystem, of the 5G ecosystem that we are imagining, then we need also more spectrum for them. So I think there are so many applications. In also, Monica, I'm sorry to mention, but that's also in many countries, Africa and Latam, we are using just the 5 gigahertz frequency band for outdoor links. And that is the only way for many people to get internet access. And those bands are somehow crowded. So we also need to consider new options for those ISPs that are providing rural connectivity. So that's just like a big picture of how regulators, all the questions that they face, and we expect that they imagine those scenarios, and they also consider the importance of giving unlicensed access in the 6 gigahertz band.
Absolutely. And we're going to talk about, Jennifer, we'll get back to you, but let's get to the poll results, and then you can comment on that.
Okay, the results. Looks like efficient, innovative use of the spectrum received 56%. Accelerate adoption of IoT applications received 17%. Enable 5G ecosystem received 14%. Bridge the digital divide received 9%. Improve indoor connectivity received 3%, and improve outdoor connectivity received just 1%.
Okay, Jennifer, what do you think?
Well, I was just reading one of the questions that had come up, and thought about what Martha was saying about working with regulators around the world. And one of the important things that we're going to need in order to truly implement an effective sharing approach is to make sure that we have knowledge of where the incumbents are so that we can protect them adequately. And having accurate databases of incumbent uses, for example, I think is a very important component of a sharing scheme. For example, in CBRS, we rely very heavily on the FCC's universal licensing system in order to protect incumbent fixed satellite earth stations. Once we know where they are, where the antenna is pointed, what its antenna pattern and gain is, we can properly implement a protection scheme for that receiver. It is really hard to protect something if you don't know where it is and you don't know what its sensitivities are. So having an accurate database of the incumbent uses is really important. And that could be a public database like the one that the FCC has implemented with the universal licensing system, or it could be a private database if that information needs to be secured and can't be made available to the public. There are ways to establish secure connections and access to such a database. But ensuring its accuracy is probably the most important part of this. And that requires the input of the incumbents, putting the onus on them that if they want to get protected, they need to make sure that the information in the database is correct. And it's going to take the will of the regulator or the ministry to impose that requirement on the incumbents and say, hey, this is important. We know it's a burden to you to give us that information and to maintain it and update it, but it's really important if we are going to make efficient and innovative use of the spectrum, which is the main benefit that people see of spectrum sharing from this poll. And I think, generally people would agree with that. So we need to encourage regulators worldwide to in turn work with their existing users and existing systems to make sure that that information can be tracked somewhere, somehow on an accurate and updated basis in order to enable sharing to work effectively.
Now, I want to ask you a quick question before, and then I wanted to have Martha comment on these results. The other one question that I get when you talk about databases and the people that are interested in rolling out or using shared spectrum, they say, oh my God, there is a database. How do we deal with it? That adds a new thing in our system. So if I'm a wireless ISP, I'm used to use unlicensed, I do whatever I want. I don't have to. Here, I need to, how do I deal with the database? So it could be seen as a major obstacle. How do we deal with that?
Martha, do you want to go first, or would you like me to tackle that one?
Why don't you just, Jennifer, just go first.
Okay.
I know that you're working more on that, and then we can talk about the other benefits.
Yeah, there have been, particularly in the 6 gigahertz context, with Wi-Fi consumer unlicensed devices, there's been a lot of concern that we're introducing too much complexity into the ecosystem and into a business model where there, that has thrived because of a lack of complexity. And we appreciate that and understand that, and frankly are working as diligently as possible to minimize the amount of interaction and additional requirements on new unlicensed devices that might be introduced into the 6 gigahertz band. What we're talking about there is possibly doing something like an AFC light, a database check-in on an infrequent basis, where the device wakes up, gets its internet connection and connects through standard APIs, the same type of software protocols that would be used to update the hardware, the software built into the Wi-Fi access point, to communicate with the database, inform the database of its location and power level, and that may be it. All we need is a registration of that device, so that in the case where there's a problem after the fact, we could go and inform that device that it needs to change to a different channel or to a different power level. Or we could have more interact with that device where it seeks to know if I wanted to operate at a higher power, what channels might be available for me, or if I wanted to maximize the efficiency of spectrum in my particular location, which channel would you recommend that I go to in order to get better throughput? So there are different gradations of interactions with an AFC database type system that would enable sharing, where it could be extremely minimal, where we're only using that database connection for correction of any problems should they occur after the fact, all the way up to a more managed interaction where you're actually maximizing the use of the spectrum for that device, and it's more like a managed service. So I think there are different gradations and different levels that we could take advantage of here, but the last thing we want to do is introduce unnecessary complexity that could slow down the development of the band or prevent people from using it. So we want to come up with a variety of solutions that can meet the challenges that we're trying to address.
Absolutely, and yeah, I think that's going to be important. I get that question all the time. Martha, you wanted to comment on the poll, or?
Yes, I want to say that it's important to be practical. And I agree, and especially want to reinforce the last message from Jennifer. It's like we don't want to add complexity where you don't need it. So it's important also to have the right conditions. There is always a trade-off between the level of confidence you want to have when you're implementing spectrum sharing and the level of complexity. So at some point, there should be a decision. Like, okay, I want to avoid any interference. I want to make sure I protect the incumbents. I want to make an efficient use of the spectrum. Then these are the tools, and this is the way I can implement them. But of course, and I also get that question very much. It's like, okay, what happens if still you have one user that is, or one or many users that are not respecting the rules? Then you use the same kind of enforcement that you use even in the licensed frequency bands. So it's important also to understand that you could also have bad users, if you can call it like that, but you have them right now in different countries, in different frequencies for different systems. So it's just to keep in mind that this is giving you more opportunities, but you don't need to make it more complex. Or sometimes it's also about creating the right environment. I was talking about that before, how the regulations enable new deployments and new technologies. That is an important trade-off to keep in mind.
Absolutely, and we are sort of getting to the end of the hour. So if there is any questions you really like to answer, please go ahead. We had a question on the coronavirus and
Yes.
sharing can help, and we've seen in the US there has been some actually spectrum sharing at 600 megahertz by T-Mobile. Loon has been deployed in Kenya to get better connectivity. and you probably know
South
of
Africa, yeah.
more options as well.
Yeah, I would like to say that, and I think we are all living this, and that's part of the success of the webinar, is like many people are feeling like they're not having to travel this week or these days. But at the same time, we are facing an incredibly hard situation. It's like everyone is trying to think, how can I help with this pandemic, with this situation? And most of us, we are just using internet access for health, for education. We have children at home. Also, we are facing e-commerce by internet because we cannot go out. So what we are facing now is that we need more broadband. And those that are isolated, that don't have any access, it's like 3 times worse because they just don't have the way to communicate or to continue their lives somehow. So we definitely think that there are some solutions that could be implemented in the short term. I've been talking to many spectrum authorities around the world, and as you mentioned, there are good examples. For example, in South Africa, the ICASA decided to allow the use of the database that was, they have a primary database and a secondary database. So they just enabled the use of the database for this period of time. So we could have more deployments that are ready to install. We also had the case of Kenya with Loon, that they're providing 4G connectivity to users, and that is also a great example. And there are so many options. So the message I would like to give from the DSA perspective is like, we are ready to support any opportunities, any projects. Sometimes the deployments, when you start from zero, you just don't have them in 1 month, but we don't know how long it's going to take. So if there are any actions that the regulators or spectrum authorities want to consider, please contact us, and we would be ready to support and to create something together if you need us.
Absolutely. Okay, Jennifer, do you have, so as sort of we get to a close, we've seen all the questions. Is there anything sort of like we can go in terms of like, and closing remarks and quick questions? We had so many questions this time, and so maybe just try to combine it and so that we all can have our final thoughts on this.
Sure. Well, you know, as we've been discussing, there have been different iterations of spectrum sharing that have been tried and implemented, you know, over the past 10 to 15 years. I think we've been learning from those early adoption experiments. And we are now at a point where I think we've got it. I think we know how to combine the technology with the right policy framework and with the ecosystem development, so that we can really leverage the capability of this technology and of spectrum sharing approaches. And again, not one size is going to fit all. I think you can take a look at a particular frequency band and decide, is this something that looks like an opportunity to make more efficient use out of it? And you can look at a band that doesn't have any users in it, and you can say, I've got a clean slate here. How could I make innovative use of this spectrum, meeting the needs of the big mobile network operators and continuing to support them, while also allowing new innovative use cases and new users to access spectrum and take advantage of the global ecosystem for that particular frequency band. So it could occur, I think spectrum sharing can be looked at for both encumbered bands as well as clean slate bands. And we've got the tools to do it, and we're excited to help folks as they're looking at their options.
Absolutely. Martha, what's next?
Well, there are so many activities going on. There are new frequency bands that are being considered for spectrum sharing, particularly in the case of the US, from 3100 to 3550 megahertz. And I think there are so many opportunities now. We are working on the tier share schemes in different countries. We are still promoting different use cases. Like all these technologies we're talking about, the 6 gigahertz advocacy is also very active. So, so I really feel like, I hope the people that participated today will just consider spectrum sharing as one additional tool in their toolkit. And I hope they will just have curiosity to learn more, so we can have more activities and we can continue talking about spectrum sharing in the future.
Yeah, and you have a very impressive list of members. And how do you work together to move forward? I know
Well, we have only 20 members, and so it's not about the large number of members, it's about the kind of members we have. And I think we are all very involved. We all share the concept that we need to provide more connectivity and more capacity around the world. So when you share that principle, it's like quite easy to get common positions. So I'm very proud of our members, and I'm sure we are being more and more active everywhere.
Absolutely. I think we're at the top of the hour, so I guess we should, Kendra, do you want to wrap up? And Jennifer and Martha, thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you guys. Okay, so that will conclude our webinar for today. Thanks again to our speakers for that great conversation. This webinar will be available on demand on SenzaFili.com in the coming days, and we will send a link to all of the registrants so that they can access the webinar. And we have one last webinar coming up in April 2020 at 11 a.m. Eastern, and that is about emerging markets needing 5G. So we hope to see you then. Thanks again for joining us today, and we'll see you at future events.